There was once a president in history known as the man-eating devil and referred to as the Napoleon of Central Africa. He showed little concern for the nation's development and was solely focused on accumulating as much wealth as possible. Let's journey back to 1921 and explore what was happening in the Central African Republic at that time. Central Africa is a shortened name for the Central African Republic, a former French colony that gained independence from France in 1960. This newly established nation faced significant influence from several Western countries right from its inception, making its path to development a challenging one. As a result of the war, the Central African Republic is now one of the 10 poorest countries in the world, ranking second from the bottom in the Human Development Index in 2019. By 2020, the population was estimated at around 5.99 million people. Despite its small population, the country is home to over 80 different ethnic groups, each with its own language. The main character in today's story is Bokassa, born on February 22, 1921, in a village about 80 kilometers from the capital of the Central African Republic. He was one of 11 siblings. His father was a local leader, so the family's living conditions were much better than many others in the village. At the time, the Central African Republic was still a French colony, and Bokassa's father constantly suffered under the oppression of the French colonists, forced to send the villagers to work at a French-owned company where they labored as slaves. When Bokassa turned 6, his father could no longer endure being a slave to the French and courageously decided to rebel against the company. Tragically, he was beaten to death by the company's men in front of the provincial headquarters. A week later, his mother, unable to bear the loss, took her own life to join her husband in death. The deaths of his parents profoundly affected Bokassa's psyche. In his youth, Bokassa attended a French Catholic school, hoping to one day become a priest respected by all. However, his teachers doubted his ability to become a priest, so he switched to studying to become a chef. Unfortunately, he didn't achieve success in this field either. In 1939, World War II broke out and France began recruiting soldiers from its African colonies. At 18, Bokassa joined the French colonial army, following the advice of his grandfather, and was assigned to the 2nd Division of the Free French Army. At the time, France had surrendered to Nazi Germany, but Charles de Gaulle remained defiant. He called on the French people to resist, not to give up, and to unite against Nazi Germany for freedom, leading to the formation of the Free French government. During World War II, Bokassa was repeatedly praised for his outstanding feats. After the war, he was awarded the French military's honor badge and stayed at a French military camp to study wireless technology. In 1950, at the age of 29, Bokassa was sent by the French government to Vietnam to participate in the war, where he earned multiple commendations. He was later awarded a Hero's Medal by the French government. While in Vietnam, Bokassa married a 17-year-old Vietnamese woman. Together they had a daughter, who was registered as a French citizen. Shortly after, his mission in Vietnam ended, and he left his wife and daughter with a promise to return, but he went back to France alone. In 1953, Bokassa returned to France, where he first trained new African soldiers as a technician. He was later promoted to the rank of lieutenant, but by then a significant issue was starting to emerge. The African continent was almost entirely divided, and the independence movement was gaining momentum. France, which held many territories in Africa, was not willing to easily give up the benefits it had gained. However, continuing the brutal warfare was not ideal. So, France devised a strategy that could be applied globally, supporting puppet leaders who were easy to control, allowing them to maintain independence in name only. In 1960, a new government was established, though it did not yet have its own military. Seizing this opportunity, France quickly withdrew. Barthélemy Boganda, hailed as the father of the Central African Republic, had his cousin, David Dacko, as the president of the country. At this time, Bokassa had already served in the French military for 21 years and had earned 12 military medals. Despite being black, he fully embraced the French spirit and revered Napoleon. In order to facilitate Bokassa's return to the Central African Republic to help build its military, French President de Gaulle personally welcomed him back. Bokassa was so proud of this gesture that he even referred to de Gaulle as his father. It's hard to imagine how Bokassa's real father would have felt if he were still alive to hear that. In 1962, Bokassa joined the Central African Armed Forces. From there, his career seemed like a game, with annual promotions from lieutenant to captain, then to colonel. To gain recognition and esteem, Bokassa employed a clever tactic. He would wear all the military medals he had received since joining the army, attend numerous events, and always sit next to his cousin, President Dacko. This was his way of signaling his importance and status. Although Bokassa's actions often attracted criticism for disregarding protocol, he had a simple response: "My cousin is the president." This statement effectively silenced any objections. Bokassa's foolish behavior paid off. Not only did the public become familiar with him, but even his cousin, President Dacko, dropped all suspicion and treated him as someone simply eager to earn more medals to survive. Though members of the president's inner circle could see through Bokassa's true intentions, and his inner motives were always clearly apparent to Dacko, the president insisted that nothing untoward could possibly be happening. In response, President Dacko formed his own special mobile police force, comprising 500 armed officers and 120 presidential bodyguards. In 1964, seeking to consolidate his power and demonstrate his ability to govern independently, Dacko began to offend many, including France, his main benefactor. During this period, Bokassa appeared to be particularly obedient. By 1965, tensions between Bokassa and his cousin had escalated significantly. First, Dacko arranged for Bokassa to visit Paris, then used his authority to bar him from returning to his homeland. This move infuriated Bokassa. He wandered around France looking for help, eventually finding a few allies, including French President Charles de Gaulle. Upon hearing that Bokassa was reaching out to the French president, Dacko became furious. He immediately revoked Bokassa's title as military advisor and began cracking down on him and his followers, promoting his own allies instead. By the end of the year, Dacko increased the budget for his mobile police force while refusing to approve the military budget for the armed forces under Bokassa's command. Furious at the situation, Bokassa confided in his inner circle that, to ensure nothing went wrong, he had recruited a powerful major in the military, Alexander Banza, who was intelligent, sharp, courageous, and had a plan. Dacko, of course, quickly realized something was wrong and decided to act immediately to eliminate Bokassa. At first, eliminating Bokassa seemed simple. They could choose a dark, quiet night to lead an attack secretly, or invite Bokassa for a dinner and deal with him swiftly. However, Bokassa, having anticipated the plot, knew that if Dacko came after him, he'd rather strike first to gain the upper hand. On December 31st, 1965, while his cousin Dacko left the presidential palace to visit a minister's house, Bokassa and Banza launched a coup. First, Bokassa tricked the leader of the 500 armed police officers and, if they refused to participate, had them detained. Afterward, he occupied the capital and broadcasted an announcement on the national radio, completing the entire process in just a few hours. By the early morning of January 1st, 1966, Bokassa had captured President Dacko, accusing him of harming the nation's development. Bokassa forced Dacko to hand over the presidency while he was in prison and, through a radio broadcast from the capital, declared to the people of Central Africa that he was now in charge. Like most dictators, Bokassa assured the public that elections would be held, a new parliament would be established, and the constitution would be amended. Once the situation stabilized, he promised to relinquish all power and withdraw from the spotlight. However, after seizing power, Bokassa reorganized the government 6 times in 1 year, expanding his presidential powers at every turn. To gain recognition on the international stage, Bokassa traveled widely. He first gained recognition from the president of Chad, François Tomboulet. Then, Bokassa told France that it had no choice but to acknowledge his newly established government, and France reluctantly agreed. Once France recognized his regime, other African nations gradually followed suit. Before 1969, Major Banza, who had joined Bokassa in the coup, became the Minister of Finance and Secretary of State of the Central African Republic. However, Banza became increasingly dissatisfied with how Bokassa was mismanaging the national funds, treating them like his personal wallet. This created a rift between them, and Bokassa attempted a coup. However, he was betrayed by his own people. Bokassa punished him with the death penalty and gave him a shallow burial. This experience taught Bokassa a valuable lesson. He could only rely on himself. No one could be fully trusted. Though Bokassa lacked formal education, he still knew how to amass wealth. After all, he was a president with immense power, and anyone who defied him would meet the same fate as Bokassa. He began to eliminate political dissidents, taking control of all aspects of the country's affairs. Bokassa assumed the positions of minister for about 10 different departments, including defense and agriculture, and held the chairmanship of 8 companies. He adhered to the principle "my country, my money," and ensured that no national currency left the country. His business empire spanned critical domestic industries, including airlines, cotton companies, diamond enterprises, and coffee. In 1971, Bokassa was promoted to general, and 5 years later, he declared himself the lifelong president of the Central African Republic. With rich mineral resources like uranium, oil, and diamonds, Bokassa frequently aligned himself with France and other Western countries economically. During the Cold War, he provided essential uranium for France's nuclear energy and weapons programs. The 20th president of France, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, referred to Bokassa as a close family friend. Bokassa often took President d'Estaing hunting in the African savannah. However, Bokassa's aspirations did not end there. Having served in the French military for 23 years and greatly influenced by French culture, he became an ardent admirer of Napoleon. In an attempt to emulate his idol, Bokassa staged a coronation ceremony to crown himself as emperor. After 11 years as president, he shifted the political system from a republic to a monarchy, transforming the Central African Republic into the Central African Empire. In October 1976, at 55 years old, Bokassa traveled to Paris to commission high-end clothing and jewelry for his coronation. The creation of the crown and rings alone consumed 13,000 natural diamonds, totaling 2,000 carats, with the largest diamond weighing 138.32 carats. He also spent vast sums on a 2-ton throne. To welcome the distinguished guests attending the ceremony and to transport the valuable items for the coronation, the Central African government rented 22 planes from abroad and used planes from France to transport 40,000 bottles of wine, 24,000 bottles of champagne, and 150 tons of other famous wines. They also used planes to transport goods from Australia, New Zealand, and France, including 25,000 fresh bouquets, 400 pounds of rose petals, and a large amount of green grass. From Normandy, France, they bought a 2,000-meter-long red carpet. From West Germany and Japan, they purchased 80 luxury cars and hundreds of motorcycles. They spent large sums of money to build the Bokassa Boulevard, Bokassa Square, and numerous other monuments to Bokassa around the country. Bokassa ordered factories to print his image on fabric and distribute it for free to the people. Despite his extravagant spending, Bokassa did make some efforts that were beneficial to the country during that period. Domestically, he oversaw the construction of several public infrastructure projects that benefited both the nation and its citizens. On December 4, 1976, Bokassa's coronation ceremony was an extraordinary event. The first to appear was the military band from the Honor Guard, with all its members eager and enthusiastic. Following them was the Royal Guard, consisting of 200 elite horsemen. Then came a convoy of police cars escorting the emperor and empress. This convoy was made up of 200 high-end motorcycles, neatly lined up, slowly moving through the crowd. Next was a regiment of soldiers carrying rifles, and finally, a convoy of 200 luxury cars, transporting guests from around the world to attend the ceremony. Bokassa invited over 4,000 distinguished guests, and a portion of them did attend. The highest-ranking guests included the Vice President of Nigeria and the First Lady of Mauritania. He had also invited the Pope, but the Pope did not attend. Bokassa invited over 100 heads of state, but none of them showed up. Even his close friend, France, only sent a minister to represent them. Many leaders refrained from attending because, at the time, they considered Bokassa to be mentally unstable. Just before his coronation, In order to receive financial support from the Libyan dictator Gaddafi, Bokassa converted from Catholicism to Islam without informing France and changed his name to Salah Eddine Ahmad Bokassa. As a result, he found himself caught between two conflicting sides and was scorned by both. Gaddafi was displeased at having to send money to France, and France, upon discovering this, became furious. After deciding to become emperor, Bokassa abandoned Islam and returned to Christianity just 3 months later. The coronation ceremony cost the country about $30 million, which accounted for a third to half of the nation's income for the year 1977. This drained the already impoverished country's resources even further. The political system of the Central African Empire failed to uplift the nation and instead pushed its people into greater hardship. The event left the national budget depleted and burdened with heavy debt. Naturally, Bokassa could not endure this situation, so he decided to stop paying wages to workers in public enterprises and halt university scholarships. He began collecting taxes for the next 3 years in advance and encouraged government officials to engage in business to earn money. Moreover, he hosted banquets and received bribes, but only those given under official pretenses were accepted. As a result, Bokassa married. He disregarded the country's established monogamy rule that had been in place since its founding. It is estimated that Bokassa had 17 wives, and these women bore him at least 50 children. Despite being the father of more than 50 children, Bokassa paid little attention to them. He ordered all primary school students across the country to wear uniforms provided by a clothing factory at a cost of $20 per set. If the children did not buy the uniforms, they would be expelled and their parents would lose their jobs. For a typical family at that time, $20 was considered a large sum. The money earned from the uniform business went into the pockets of the factory's owner, a powerful figure behind the scenes known as the Queen. In early 1979, 3 years after Bokassa declared himself emperor, France was deeply disappointed with him, but still held out hope for a resolution. However, not long after, Bokassa completely shattered France's expectations. In April of that year, in protest of the government's forced purchase of expensive school uniforms, many elementary school students took to the streets in demonstrations and organized marches. Without hesitation, Bokassa ordered the arrest of the children and the adults behind the protests. During this process, hundreds of children lost their lives. In the subsequent trial, Bokassa was charged with the deaths of at least 5 innocent children, but the public only learned of the incident nearly a month later. Several European countries and the United States immediately intervened, launching a wave of public condemnation against Bokassa. However, the true motivations behind these nations' actions were clear to all. On September 21, 1979, Bokassa traveled to Libya for a state visit, unaware that this would be his last trip. Former President Dacko, though previously stripped of power, was not dead but had simply remained in silence for a long time. Of course, Dacko would not miss this rare opportunity while Bokassa was under widespread criticism. While Bokassa was abroad, Dacko, with the help of France, staged a coup, overthrowing the Central African Empire and reclaiming the presidency. Meanwhile, Bokassa was sentenced to death by the Central African court and became a wanted fugitive, beginning his life in exile. Due to his reckless actions during his time in power, Bokassa became an international criminal, and many countries were unwilling to grant him political asylum, including France. Bokassa then flew to Côte d'Ivoire, seeking refuge, where he lived in Abidjan, the country's largest city, for 4 years. During his exile, he was always preoccupied with finding a way to regain power. In September 1981, André Kalinga, the Central African military leader, supported by President Dacko, staged a coup. Soon after taking the presidency, Dacko's cousin, Kalinga, was swiftly ousted from his position. With no opposition from Dacko's cousin, France finally relaxed its stance and agreed to let Bokassa emigrate to France. Bokassa then moved to a villa in the suburbs of Paris, which he had purchased for himself. During his rule, Bokassa had amassed great wealth from the people. It was rumored that he had over $10 billion in his accounts, as well as numerous properties in Switzerland and France. On October 22, 1986, just 1 year before President Kalinga's term ended, Bokassa suddenly left France. He hadn't given up and secretly used a fake passport in an attempt to return to the Central African Republic to reclaim his power. However, Bokassa encountered an obstacle when he was recognized while flying. As soon as the plane landed, Bokassa was arrested and thrown into prison. 2 months later, he was charged with multiple crimes, including embezzling national assets, murder, treason, and cannibalism, a total of 14 charges. You're probably wondering where the charge of cannibalism came from, right? According to a chef, Bokassa had a taste for human flesh. The chef claimed to have seen human meat being prepared in the cold storage at Bokassa's house. Bokassa's cousin, Dako, also stated that he had seen images of human corpses in the cold storage at Bokassa's house, though the purpose of these photos was unclear. In fact, during Bokassa's rule, a chilling legend spread that he often turned those who opposed him into meals for himself and select guests. The inedible parts would be fed to the lions and crocodiles in his private zoo. On June 12, 1987, aside from the cannibalism charge, which lacked sufficient evidence, all the other charges had enough credible proof. Bokassa was sentenced to death and had his personal assets confiscated. However, Bokassa served only 6 years in prison before being released, after which he lived in the capital of the Central African Republic. 2 months after Bokassa was released from prison, his wife's cousin, Ange Felix Patas, became president following the first and only democratic election in the country. This was the only election in Central African Republic's history, as all subsequent presidents came to power through coups. On November 3, 1996, Bokassa passed away at his home from heart disease at the age of 75, bringing an end to his tumultuous life. And that's the story of the life of the Napoleon of Central Africa, Bokassa. Over the course of his 11 years in power, the number of people who mysteriously disappeared or were unjustly imprisoned is countless. He not only failed to fulfill his initial promises, but allowed power to cloud his judgment, leading him down a path of ruthless dictatorship that caused untold suffering for his people. What are your thoughts on this former president?
In the late 1970s and mid-1980s, drug trafficking organizations grew rapidly and powerfully. Among them, a large, brutal, efficient, and meticulously organized criminal group emerged as a supreme force, the Guadalajara Cartel. This cartel was founded in 1978 by Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and a mastermind behind the criminal empire that committed crimes whose repercussions are still felt throughout Mexico decades after its collapse. The head of this empire is known by various names such as the Godfather, the Drug Tsar, and the most famous title, the Kingpin of Kingpins, Joaquin Guzman, one of Mexico's most notorious drug lords. However, within the cartel, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, a powerful and influential figure, initially served as a mere bodyguard. Felix Gallardo was born on January 8, 1946, and grew up on a farm in Bella Vista, a suburb of Culiacan, Sinaloa. After graduating high school, Gallardo studied business at university before taking a job as a federal justice agent in Mexico, a role similar to the FBI in the USA, tasked with enforcing federal laws and combating drug trafficking. However, this agency was rife with corruption, and Gallardo used it to protect and shield his drug trafficking activities. Eventually, the agency was disbanded in 2002 due to high levels of corruption. During his time as a federal agent in the mid to late 1960s, Gallardo was assigned as a bodyguard for the governor of Sinaloa, Leopoldo Sanchez Celis. The relationship between Gallardo and the governor developed to the point where Gallardo was chosen to be the godfather to Sanchez's son. This relationship helped Gallardo build important political connections to protect and advance his drug trafficking organization. Gallardo was introduced to the drug trade through connections with Pedro Avilas Perez, also known as Don Pedro. If you know the history of Mexican drug cartels, you will know that it all began with Don Pedro. He was also known as El León de la Sierra, or the Lion of the Sierra, referring to the Sierra Madre mountain range in Mexico where he lived and operated. Don Pedro became the first major drug lord in Mexico by the late 1960s. Second-generation traffickers like Felix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo all learned the trade from Don Pedro. Drug trafficking has changed significantly over the past 60 years. Initially, unnecessary violence and official cartels were rare. Back when Gallardo was starting out, there were only two major drug cartels in Mexico, the Gulf Cartel and the Avilas Cartel, led by Don Pedro. Compared to today, when law enforcement identifies the existence of dozens of drug cartels and 36 smaller or supplementary groups involved in drug trafficking, the Gulf Cartel, led by Juan Nepomuceno, was still at the forefront and continued to exist. Since the 1930s, smuggling organizations in the USA during Prohibition operated from Matamoros, Tamaulipas, just across the border from Brownsville, Texas. They engaged in various types of organized crime such as gambling, prostitution, auto theft, and also sold a small amount of heroin. However, by the 1970s, drug trafficking was no longer their main focus. In contrast, the Avilas organization was centered along the Sierra Mountains in the Golden Triangle area of Chihuahua, Sinaloa, and Durango. From this remote location, Don Pedro was able to establish a drug trafficking organization and distribute large quantities of contraband. This group primarily trafficked in marijuana and heroin, but was also one of the first to start smuggling cocaine from South America into the USA, with their main goal being to get drugs into the USA. At that time, at least initially, no violence occurred, and which is quite rare for drug cartels. Don Pedro forbade violence as he saw it as an unnecessary distraction that would draw unwanted attention to the cartel and threaten the business. So, how does one engage in drug trafficking without using violence? The Avilas cartel protected its empire with dollars instead of bullets, and through his connections, Felix Gallardo brokered a deal with law enforcement. This agreement had two rules. Don Pedro would be granted specific operational areas where he was allowed to trade drugs as long as he maintained peace in those areas and was willing to share a portion of his drug profits to benefit the local economy. Things went smoothly in the early to mid-1970s, allowing the cartel to grow rapidly. However, other traffickers or drug trafficking groups began to emerge throughout Mexico, and things really started to deteriorate in 1978. Information from USA and Mexican authorities later revealed that a power struggle had erupted between Don Pedro and Felix Gallardo, leading each of them to conspire to gain full control of the cartel. Just before Don Pedro's death, there was a meeting of drug trafficking leaders in Mexico. Gallardo wanted to form a large cartel that included all the leaders of the drug trafficking groups, but Don Pedro did not see the need and was particularly offended when one of his rivals, Gallardo, brought all the parties together. Anyway, we know that right after this meeting, Don Pedro was killed, and to this day there are many mysteries surrounding his death. The official version states that he was killed in a shootout with law enforcement on September 15, 1978, about 6 miles from Culiacan at a police checkpoint near a highway junction. However, there are at least 4 different versions of what actually happened. The most interesting version is the one from Netflix's Narcos Mexico, in which Don Pedro is shot dead by the police, and then Gallardo is handed a handgun to deliver the final shot to his head. After Don Pedro's death, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Don Neto, and Rafael Caro Quintero, Rafa, took over the leadership of the cartel. According to the earlier meeting, they coordinated the production and trafficking operations of various groups, which formed the core of what would later be known as the Guadalajara cartel. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo took drug trafficking to a new level. With his experience working in the Mexican Federal Judicial Police and his connections with the Sinaloa governor, Gallardo could leverage many of his political connections to protect the new organization. They then began producing high-quality seedless marijuana, known as sinsemilla, in large quantities on vast fields, something that had never been done on such a scale before in history. By the early 1980s, Colombian drug cartels were flooding the USA with large quantities of cocaine and the USA. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, focused its efforts primarily on Florida, the main destination for Colombian cartels importing tons of cocaine via the Bahamas and then into Florida through Miami. To avoid law enforcement scrutiny in Florida, Colombian cartels began using Mexico as a transit point. This began through Honduran smuggler Juan Ramon Mata Ballesteros, the main link between the Guadalajara cartel and Colombian cartels. He introduced the Avilas cartel to Santiago Ocampo of the Cali cartel, one of Colombia's largest cartels. This time, instead of receiving a 25 to 30% commission in cash for transportation services as Don Pedro had done, the Guadalajara cartel would take 50% of the cocaine. They handled the transportation and distribution themselves, marking a breakthrough for the Guadalajara cartel. Thanks to handling and distributing cocaine themselves, the Guadalajara cartel's profits soared to about $5 billion annually. By the mid-1980s, they also collaborated with Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel to assist in smuggling cocaine across the USA border. Again, this was arranged through Mata, making the Guadalajara cartel the dominant force in North American drug trafficking during the 1980s, witnessing the rise of notorious drug lords like El Chapo and El Mayo. By the mid-1980s, the Guadalajara cartel completely dominated the drug trade in Mexico, with Gallardo considered the kingpin of the criminal world. By this time, he owned over 50 homes and 200 farms, with an estimated total value of $500 million. Gallardo protected the Guadalajara cartel's drug trafficking operations primarily with money and bribery rather than ammunition. Much of their operation was safeguarded by local law enforcement, politicians, and Mexico's secret police, equivalent to the CIA in the USA at the time. The USA CIA was also alleged to use the drug trade in Mexico to secretly fund President Ronald Reagan's anti-communist efforts in Nicaragua. This was a major issue, as after the Iran-Contra scandal was uncovered, it became the only way for the Contra faction to receive financial support. The Iran-Contra scandal, which occurred in 1986 during Reagan's presidency, involved senior USA officials secretly selling arms to Iran in violation of an arms export ban. The plan was created under a different pretext to secure the release of USA hostages in Iran. When public outrage erupted over the White House exchanging arms for hostages, the money earned from the arms deals was subsequently used to fund the rebel groups in Nicaragua. However, not everyone in law enforcement agreed with this. The USA government and the Mexican military were still trying to apprehend drug traffickers. In 1984, based on information from DEA agent Kiki Camarena, 450 Mexican soldiers, supported by helicopters, conducted Operation Godfather and destroyed a 500-acre marijuana plantation called Rancho Buffalo in Chihuahua with an estimated annual yield of $2.5 billion. This was an unacceptable blow to the Guadalajara cartel and the USA CIA-backed scheme to fund Contra operations in Nicaragua. This was also the second field that Kiki had destroyed, making him a significant problem. The DEA reported that by January 1985, Kiki was very close to uncovering a billion-dollar drug network involving the CIA, Mexican government officials, politicians, local police, and the Guadalajara cartel. Because he was about to expose the entire operation of the Guadalajara cartel, he was abducted in broad daylight on February 7, 1985. Camarena was then taken to a Guadalajara cartel safe house at 881 Lope de Vega Street in western Guadalajara. There, Kiki was beaten, tortured, and interrogated for approximately 30 hours. To keep him awake during the ordeal, the cartel continuously injected him with stimulants. Eventually, Camarena's body was found almost a month later, wrapped in plastic and discarded next to a farm in Michoacán. The torture and murder of Camarena sparked outrage from the USA DEA, which launched Operation Legend, the largest murder investigation ever conducted by the DEA. The DEA sent a special unit from the USA to coordinate the investigation in Mexico. The investigation quickly pointed to the three leaders of the Guadalajara cartel as those responsible. Within less than 2 months, Caro Quintero and Fonseca Carrillo were arrested. However, Felix Gallardo, with his connections, was not investigated and was protected. He was shielded by politicians in Sinaloa and later in Guadalajara, where he could avoid arrest. From this point on, The kingpin of the kingpins disappeared from the public eye and moved to Mazatlan for a few years before returning to Guadalajara in 1987. One of his first actions upon arriving in the city was to contact Guillermo González Calderón, the head of the Federal Judicial Police of Mexico and also his associate. Calderón ensured that despite Gallardo's name appearing in the Camarena case, authorities did not have enough evidence against him. Even if Carlos Salinas was elected and assumed the presidency, everything would be resolved. Although Salinas won the presidency in one of the most controversial and suspicious elections in Mexican history, but nothing could save Gallardo. On April 8, 1989, Gallardo was finally arrested after agreeing to meet Calderón at a restaurant in Guadalajara and was taken away in front of his wife and 2 children. This arrest was largely intended to redirect public attention from the controversial presidential election to the capture of Mexico's most wanted man. A USA law exists that allows for the denial of aid and even the imposition of trade and financial sanctions against countries involved in the production and trafficking of illegal drugs. The exact price to avoid these sanctions was none other than the arrest of Felix Gallardo, the kingpin of the kingpins. Gallardo was arrested at the age of 43, charged in both Mexico and the USA with kidnapping and murdering Kiki Camarena, as well as extortion, drug trafficking, and several other crimes. The hunt and arrest of Gallardo truly became a catalyst for exposing widespread corruption in Mexico's political and law enforcement sectors. Within days of Gallardo's arrest, several police chiefs were also arrested, with around 90 other officers deserting and disappearing. Although imprisoned, Gallardo still maintained control over the Guadalajara cartel. However, with the 3 cartel leaders arrested, Gallardo considered that diversification would be more effective and less likely to be dismantled by law enforcement. Thus, in a meeting arranged by his lawyer, several top drug lords in Mexico met in 1989 at a house in Acapulco, where they divided the territory of the Guadalajara cartel into different factions. The Tijuana route would go to Gallardo's nephews, the Arellano Felix brothers. The Juarez route would remain with the Carrillo Fuentes family. Miguel Caro Quintero would manage the Sonora corridor. Joaquin Guzman, El Chapo, and Hector Luis Palma would handle operations on the Pacific coast, joined by Ismael Zambada Garcia El Mayo. Philip Gallardo was sentenced to 45 years in prison, and after serving 28 years, he continues to serve his sentence. In 2017, Gallardo was retried and sentenced to an additional 37 years for the death of Kiki Camarena. Notably, both then and now Gallardo has always maintained that he was not involved in Kiki's murder and had actually warned Rafa that killing a DEA agent would be unnecessary and would only anger the USA government, focusing attention on the Guadalajara cartel. And of course, he was right while in prison. Despite this, Gallardo continued to try to coordinate the fragmented cartels via mobile phones until he was transferred to a maximum security prison in 1993. At this facility, there were no phones, and that ended any hopes he had of continuing to oversee the cartels. He was sent to the Federal Social Readaptation Center, Noone in Altiplano, Juarez, which opened in 1991 and was considered Mexico's supermax prison. This center has housed dozens of drug cartel leaders and was advertised as impenetrable and escape-proof. That was until June 11, 2015, when El Chapo escaped through a nearly 1-mile-long tunnel dug beneath the prison, eventually emerging 33 feet through the bathroom floor of El Chapo's cell. Gallardo was not so fortunate. His transfer to the maximum security facility effectively dashed his hopes of restoring unity among the rival cartels. In the 30 years following the collapse of the Guadalajara cartel, the remaining 4 cartels fought and splintered into 9 cartels that now dominate drug trafficking in Mexico. Today, these cartels rely on violence to claim territories and smuggling routes rather than bribing officials like their predecessors. These ongoing disputes and escalating conflicts have created political, social, and military chaos known as the Mexican Drug War. As for Gallardo, he has been continuously imprisoned since 1989. It is said that during his time there, he could only go outside for about 45 minutes each day and spent the rest of the time locked in a cell with minimal and poor quality food, no medical care, and no family visits. By 2008, the former drug lord's children created a website, MiguelFelixGallardo.com, in an effort to call on the sitting president to intervene and ensure their father received better medical care. As he aged, Felix Gallardo experienced several health issues, including deafness, loss of an eye, and cardiovascular problems. In March 2013, Gallardo launched a legal battle to request house arrest at the age of 70. However, a Mexican federal court denied his request. In 2014, they approved his transfer to a medium security prison in Guadalajara due to his deteriorating health, where he remains to this day. What do you think of this story? Please leave your thoughts below so everyone can know. Don't forget to like and subscribe to support me. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.